Chapter 1. What, Where, How and When. Rashida's question. Rashida sat reading the newspaper. Suddenly her eyes fell on small headline. 100 years ago. How, she wondered, could anyone know what happened so many years ago? Finding out what happened. Yesterday, you could listen to the radio, watch the television, read a newspaper. Last year, ask somebody who remembers, but what about long, long ago? Let us see how it can be done. What can we know about the past? There are several things we can find out: what people ate, what kinds of clothes they wore, the house in which they lived. We can find out about the lives of hunters, herders, farmers, rulers, merchants, priests, craftspersons, artists, musicians, and scientists. We can also find out about the games children played, the stories they heard, the play they saw, the songs they sang. Where did people live? Find the river Narmada on map 1, page 2. People have lived along the bank of this river for several 100,000 years. Some of the earliest people who lived here were skilled gatherers, that is, people who gathered their food. They know about the vast wealth of plants in the surrounding and forest and collected roots, fruits and other forest produce for their food. They also hunted animals. Now find the Suleiman and Kithar hills to the northwest. Some of the areas where women and men first began to grow crops such as wheat, barley about 8,000 years ago are located here. People also began rearing animals like sheep, goat and cattle and lived in villages. Locate the Garo hills to the northeast and the Vindhyas in the central India. These were some of the other areas where agriculture developed. The place where rice was first grown are to the north of the Vindhyas. Trace the river Indus and its tributaries. Tributaries are the smaller rivers that flow into a larger river. About 4,700 years ago, some of the earliest cities flourished on the bank of these rivers. Later, about 2,500 years ago, cities developed on the banks of Ganga and its tributaries and along the sea coast. Locate the Ganga and its tributaries called the Sun. In ancient time, the areas along with these rivers to the south of the Ganga was known as Magadha, now lying in the state of Bihar. Its rulers were very powerful and set up a large kingdom. Kingdoms were set up in the other parts of the country as well. Throughout, people traveled from one part of the subcontinent to the another. The hills and the high mountains, including the Himalayas, deserts, rivers and seas, made journey dangerous at times, but never impossible. So men and women moved in search of livelihoods, as also to escape from natural disasters like floods or droughts. Sometimes men marched in armies, conquering others' land. Besides, merchants traveled with caravans or ships carrying valuable goods from one place to another. And religious teachers walked from village to village, town to town, stopping to offer instruction and advice on the way. Finally, some people perhaps traveled driven by spirit of adventure, wanting to discover new and exciting places. All these led to sharing of ideas between people. Why do people travel nowadays? Look at the map 1 for once more. Hills, mountains and seas from the natural frontiers of the subcontinent. While it was difficult to cross these frontiers, those who wanted could and did scale the mountains and cross the seas. People from across the frontiers also came into subcontinent and settled here. These movements of people enriched our cultural traditions. People have shared new ways of carving stone, composing music and even cooking food over several hundred of years. Names of the land. Two of the words we often use for our country are India and Bharat. The word India comes from Indus, called Sindhu in Sanskrit. Find Iran and Greece in your atlas. The Iranians and the Greeks who came through the northwest about 2,500 years ago and were familiar with the Indus called it the Hindus or the Indos, and the land to the east of the river was called India. The name Bharata was used for a group of people who lived in the northwest and who are mentioned in Rig Veda. The earliest composition in Sanskrit, dated to about 3,500 years ago, later was used for the country. Finding out about the past. There are several ways of finding out about the past. One is to search for and read books that have written long ago. These are called manuscripts because they were written by hand. This comes from Latin word manu, meaning hand. These were usually written on palm leaf or on the specially prepared bark of tree known as the birch, which grows in Himalayas. Over the years, many manuscripts were eaten away by insects. Some of them were destroyed, but many have survived, often preserved in temples and monasteries. This book dealt with all kinds of subjects, religious beliefs and practices, the lives of kings, medicines and science. Besides, there were epics, poems, plays. Many of these were written in Sanskrit, others were Prakrit, the language used by ordinary people, and Tamil. We can also study inscriptions. These are writing on relatively hard surfaces such as stone or metal. Sometimes kings got their orders inscribed so that the people could see, read and obey them. There are other kinds of inscriptions as well, where men and women, including kings and queens, recorded what they did. For example, kings often kept records of the victories in battle. Can you think of the advantage of writing on a hard surface? And what could have been the difficulties? There were many other things that were made and used in the past. Those who study these objects are called archaeologists. They study the remains of buildings made of stone and brick, paintings and sculptures. They also explore and excavate, that is, digging under the surface of the earth to find tools, weapons, pots, pans, ornaments and coins. Some of these objects may be made of stone, others of bone, baked clay or metal. Objects that are made of hard, imperishable substance usually survive for a long time. Archaeologists also look for bones of animals, birds and fish to find out what people ate in the past. Plant remains survive far more rarely if seeds of the grain or pieces of wood have been burned. They survive in a charred room. Do you think of cloth is found frequently by archaeologists? Historians, that is the scholars who study the past, often use the word source to refer to the information found from manuscripts, inscriptions and archaeology. One source are found learning about the past comes from adventure as we reconstruct it bit by bit. So historians and the archaeologists are like detectives who use all these sources like clues to find out about the past. One past or many? Did you notice the title of the book, Our Pasts? We have used the word pasts in plural to draw the attention to the fact that the past was different for other groups of people. For example, the lives of herders or farmers were different from those of kings and queens. The lives of merchants were different from those of craft persons and so on. Also, as is true even today, people follow different practices and customs in different parts of the country. For example, today most people living in Andaman Island get their own food by fishing, hunting and collecting forest produce. By contact, most people living in cities depend on the others for supply of food. Differences such as these existed in the past as well. Besides, there is another kind of difference. We should know a great deal about kings and the battles they fought because they kept record of their victories. Generally, ordinary people such as hunters, fishing folk, gatherers, farmers or herders did not keep record of what they did. While archaeology helps us to find about their lives, there is much that remains unknown. Why do dates mean? If somebody asks you the date, you will probably mention the day, month and year. 2000 and something. These years are counted from the date generally assigned to a birth of Jesus Christ, the founder of Christianity. So 2000 means 2000 years after the birth of Christ. All the dates before the birth of Christ are counted backwards and usually have the letters BC, before Christ, added on. In this book, we will refer on the dates going back from the present and using 2000 as one starting point. Letters with dates. BC, we have seen, stands for before Christ. You will sometimes find AD before dates. This stands for two Latin words, Anno Domini, which means in the year of the Lord, that is Christ. So 2012 can also be written as AD 2012. Sometimes CE is used instead of AD and BCE is instead of BC. The letter CE stands for the Common Era and BCE stands for Before Common Era. We use this term because the Christian era is now used in most countries of the world. In India, we began using the form of dating from about 200 years ago, and sometimes the letter BP, meaning before Christ, presents are used. Finding two dates mentioned on page 3, which set of letters would you use for them? Elsewhere, we have seen that the inscriptions are inscribed on hard surfaces. Many of these were inscribed several hundred years ago. All inscription contains both script and languages. Languages which are used as well as scripts have changed over time. So how do scholars understand what was inscribed? This can be done through a process known as decipherment. One of the most famous stories of decipherment comes from Egypt, a country in North Africa where there were kings and queens about 5,000 years ago. Rosetta, in a town of the north coast of Egypt, and here are inscribed stones were found, which contain inscriptions in 3 different languages and scripts, Greek and 2 forms of Egyptian. Scholars who could read Greek figures out that the names of the kings and queens were enclosed in a little frame called a cartouche. They then placed the Greek and Egyptian signs side by side and identified the sound for which the Egyptian letters stood. As you can see, a lion stood for L, a bird stood for L, A. Once they knew what was the letter stood for, they could read the other inscriptions as well.